Hello, it's great to be back. This is episode 1.08 of Living the Ministry Years, and today we're going to be looking at the meeting of Philip and Nathanael, probably also known as Bartholomew, with Jesus. So let's make a start. We normally start with the text, which is about 8 or 9 verses today, so we're going to be reading it's John 1 verse 43 to 51. So on the next day being the day after Jesus has met Peter, so on the next day Jesus wanted to set out towards Galilee, and he found Philip, and Jesus said to him, "Travel with me." It's a fantastic start, that. Can you imagine this? Of all of the various disciples, I mean, John's Gospel really starts with Andrew and John, because obviously they're the eyewitnesses, and the day they met him was just before they introduced Peter, which is of course the day before this. So that's great. We get their perspective, but you get the sense from this verse that Jesus already has a relationship with Philip in that kind of rabbi role. As I mentioned before, they address Jesus when they meet him as rabbi, which implies he has some sort of status. And so it's been fantastic to have been Philip. Well, I say it's fantastic to have been Philip. So we're going to see he dies quite painfully, but the honour of the fact that Jesus actually goes to find him. Isn't that wonderful? So anyways, it's just a little kind of aside from my point of view. So Jesus goes and finds Philip and says, "Travel with me." And you can't help but kind of get a sense of the flow of the text. So Andrew has met him one day, and then he's introduced Peter. And Peter and Andrew live in Capernaum. That's where they got their business. And that's, of course, also how they know John, because John comes from Capernaum as well. But Peter and Andrew grew up, it tells us, in Bethsaida. And the fact it bothered to tell us that is the only place we understand that from the entire New Testament, that they kind of grew up in Bethsaida, is probably to prompt us to understand that actually it triggered something. Oh, Jesus thinks, I know somebody else from there. And anyway, the next day, I'm going to go back to Galilee. So here's some guys from Galilee, and I know somebody else from their hometown. So he goes and gets Philip. Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the same town as Andrew and Peter. We've just been thinking. So Philip found Nathanael. Now, it's interesting. I've always kind of grown up. You kind of read these things, and it sounds like kind of one thing after another. But as I understand more, as I've studied more, you realise that ancient storytelling, as is actually the case in good modern storytelling, is not quite as obviously kind of crassly kind of chronological as that. It kind of arranges things. Chronology is just one way in which things are connected, i.e. this happened, then this happened. But actually, more realistically, we tend to tell stories with much kind of wider, broader sense of what connects them. And so I suspect that this little incident here about the Philip introducing Nathanael, it needn't have happened directly after Jesus goes and gets Philip. It may have been something that's already happened. It's just kind of explaining that. So there is a kind of a sense of progression of chronology where John and Andrew meet Jesus, then Andrew goes and gets his brother Simon, and Simon meets him, and then the next day Jesus thinks, we're off to Galilee, so I'll go and get Philip. But the next little bit about Nathanael could have already happened, maybe in this context, maybe not. So Philip found, so I put the word "so," which kind of links it in our minds chronologically, but it doesn't say that. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We found the one that Moses wrote of in the law." You see. So, because here's Jesus, he's intended to go back to Galilee. Anyway, so we're hearing this story, whether it happened in the flow of chronology or whether it's a little bit of a backward look. We found the one that Moses wrote of in the law and the prophets. See, this is showing something of Philip's quality. He already recognises it. He sees it in Jesus. And so in that sense, you kind of get the feel that seeing as Jesus knew Philip before he knew John and Andrew, that maybe Philip is one of the first people really to understand who Jesus is. Whether this happened beforehand or whether it's happening in the flow of these things, he already sees it, just as Andrew has said it. And in his testimony, he's kind of building up, just as Andrew said to Peter, "Come and see the one who is the Christ." But Jesus already knew Philip, and here is Philip understanding and recognising. And so he seems to either now, or previously, he's gone and got Nathanael and said, "We found the one that Moses wrote of in the law and the prophets, Jesus the son of Joseph from Nazareth." See, and he uses the town Nazareth, and Nathanael answers, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Now you think, what on earth is he doing saying that? Nazareth is a tiny, tiny little town. And in fact, historically, we didn't even know where it was until kind of only last century. It was so tiny, it just disappeared into the stories of history. But actually, it's not that far from the town of Cana, which is where Jesus is heading. And right at the end of John's Gospel, we're actually told that Nathanael actually comes from Cana. So Nathanael is someone, and he's just up the road from Nazareth in Cana. And in this context, he's grown up there, and he's known this tiny little town. And Philip has kind of gone and said and introduced Jesus, not just someone from Galilee, but actually for someone who lives in Cana, you know where Nazareth is. And you guys have had that kind of response from Nathanael. Can anything good come from there? He doesn't come from that far away. So perhaps it's not particularly being rude. He's just making a comment on how tiny and insignificant this little town is. This little tiny town of Nazareth. But it's interesting that the word Nazareth comes up here, because we're going to see in a little while there seems to be a context to the way Nathanael is thinking that Jesus kind of focuses in on, and it's fascinating. We're going to do it in the second half of what I'm doing. I'm kind of what we're going to look at once I've read the text. I want to look a little bit about the traditions around Philip and Nathanael, and then at the end I want us to really dissect the conversation that I'm just about to read to you has, because actually it's deeply rich with kind of biblical allusions that we're less familiar with, and so we miss them. And also some of the allusions only make sense if you look at the Hebrew words behind them, and here's one of them, Nazareth, as we're going to see. So here's Nathanael. He answers, "Can anything good come from out of Nazareth?" And Philip retorted, which is the really good evangelist kind of response, "Well, let's not argue about it. Come and have a look. Come and see. Find out for yourself." So anyway, Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him and said about him, "Look, this is genuinely an Israelite in whom there is no trickiness," or no guile is often the way we read it, no trickiness. And Nathanael responded and said, "How do you know me?" That's interesting, isn't it? We're going to stop and think. Before Jesus says anything about the fig tree, which we'll think about in a minute, before he says anything like that, which may have been, oh, how did he know that? Jesus simply says, "You're an Israelite in whom there's no trickiness." And it triggers something, and that's why I say we're going to analyse this. So I mustn't go off on a tangent now, because I want us to think about the characters first, and then we'll think about the conversation. So Jesus says, "How do you know me?" And Jesus answered, "Because before Philip called you, when you were under that fig tree, I saw you." And Nathanael started to speak, saying, "Rabbi, then you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And Jesus answered and said to him, "You trust me because I told you I saw you underneath the fig tree. You're going to see greater things than these." And he said to them, "Really, truly, I tell you that from today you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." It's an incredible revelation. And it finishes that revelation with Jesus effectively taking on himself that image which is foundational to the whole identity of Israel, which happened when Jacob saw the house of God, the Bethel, and saw the angels ascending and descending. And Jesus is saying, you're going to see me in that way, which implies to us that there's something about Bethel, the house of God, that Nathanael has been thinking about. So that's all just stuff to park for the minute, and we're going to come back to it, and we'll look at the Old Testament kind of backdrop to this conversation that Jesus has with Nathanael. But let's just think a little bit, as I often want to do, is just kind of, because I wanted to kind of get a feel of the characters. So Philip is often confused with Philip the Evangelist. So Philip the Apostle is not the same as Philip the Evangelist. And the confusion has been happening since about the 2nd century, where you find various kind of writings of the early church which often confuse the two, which means unravelling their stories is sometimes complicated. Eusebius does it so much that that actually by very early on, kind of church historians were saying his testimony to the Apostle Philip is totally pointless because he just confuses the two so regularly. So it's important we kind of unravel the two, and so it's Philip that we read about in the book of Acts, who's kind of bouncing around in Syria, meets the Ethiopian eunuch and so on. Philip the Apostle, we don't really pick up so much about in the book of Acts. Philip the evangelist was one of the 72, and probably Luke was too. So you've got that kind of connection, which is probably why he appears in the book of Acts. But that doesn't mean to say there's nothing we can say about Philip. I mean, obviously in the Gospels he plays quite a key role, particularly in John, which implies to me that he's someone that is there at the time where John's Gospel is being written, which is interesting because he probably therefore gets martyred. As we're going to see, both Philip and Nathanael get martyred before about 68 AD. Now, I put the writing of John, if you followed this series, in about 64, so just a few years before Philip is going to get martyred, because otherwise I think it's unlikely that the author of the Gospel of John would have put him right at the beginning and then right at the end, because that was an ancient way of saying, this is one of my eyewitnesses. They're here at the beginning, they're here at the end, they covered all of these events, and they were part of what produced this work, you see. So if that is the case with Philip, and he dies before, as we're going to see, the tradition is probably pretty good in that he dies before Nathanael dies, and Nathanael seems to die in around 68 AD, and we can date that from the story about who it was who killed him. So as a result, we kind of, again, it kind of draws this idea that the Gospels actually kind of originated before a lot of modern thinking says they did. But anyway, that's not for today. I need to kind of stay on target. So I always want to do these things, go off on a tangent. But if you think about Philip's role within the gospel, there are various little bits and pieces. He's there at the feeding of the 5,000, and he asks Jesus. Jesus actually says to him, "How are we going to feed them?" And there's no context given to that question from Jesus, but it's one of those wonderful little kind of confirmations of the authenticity of the Gospels, because we know he comes from Bethsaida, and we know that the feeding of the 5,000 happens just outside of Bethsaida. So actually that question of Jesus to Philip, how are we going to feed them, is kind of almost like, let's answer this question in the natural. You're from around here. If anyone knows where you can get bread for 5,000 people, it would be Philip. You see, so that's a nice little touch. So he's there at the feeding of the 5,000. He's also the link at the end of Jesus' ministry, at the beginning of his last week. A group of Greeks come and they're talking to Philip. Now, Philip is a Greek name, and he grew up in Bethsaida, as you said, which is technically outside of Galilee. It's just across the border of Jordan, just across the Jordan on the other side. So it's kind of within the region of the Sea of Galilee, but it's a kind of an administrative area. It's kind of that sits, I think, slightly outside of technically the boundary that was covered by Herod Antipas. But he's growing up in an area that's heavily influenced by the Greek. It's interesting that Andrew is a Greek name too. It's Peter and Andrew, Philip. See, they've got that heavily Hellenistic influence. So it may be that actually he's more comfortable speaking in Greek than he is in Hebrew. It's just a question of they'll speak both languages, but which order did they learn them in? Anyway, in that last week, it's Greeks who find Philip first, and then Philip introduces them to Andrew. So you got that kind of, actually just the fact that they both got Greek names makes them kind of accessible to those from the Greek-speaking world. Just helps, I guess, as they become evangelists and go off taking the mission of the church out in the years that come after the crucifixion. But then perhaps what's perhaps Philip's moment, or I think anyway of those ways, is he's the one at the Last Supper who prompts that question about show us the Father, which actually gives Jesus this wonderful opportunity to express the unity of Father, Son and Holy Spirit, and that kind of wonderful passage that you get at the end of John's Gospel. And it's Philip's question, Philip's interjection at that point. So you find him kind of through the Gospels in those ways. As you come out of the Gospels, there's a kind of an very old church tradition, whether it's kind of a bit fabricated, is that during the kind of resurrection period, Jesus commissions each one of the disciples with kind of a particular task in carrying out of the Great Commission, and Philip is understood as kind of covering the area of kind of Syria and up into the region that kind of now is modern Turkey. And so the stories we have of Philip in this kind of context, doing evangelism, they're difficult to, as is often the way, that they're now packed full of kind of apocryphal stories. I think it's Philip. that is it. Philip, I'm just trying to think now. He has a letter written about him and a dialogue, and I think there's a talking leopard in one of his stories, which is you know. I was going to say could have happened, but I think it's more likely that I mean, obviously, yeah, there's Esau's donkey, not Esau. Okay, I thought about talking leopards. I was thinking about talking donkeys. And I was going to say Aesop. It's not Aesop. Balaam's ass, of course, does talk, but I suspect that the story of the talking leopard, among other things, is more of a kind of the way in which a story has grown about Philip. But we do, the stories we do have of him, and also of him being martyred, which does happening in those kind of Syria up into kind of Turkey area. And interestingly, there's a kind of an interesting kind of mix, therefore, with the character of Bartholomew, because Nathanael has traditionally been thought of as being the same person as Bartholomew. Now, a lot of modern scholars will throw that out, and I kind of understand why, because what they say is in the past people were too quick to think that because someone shared a name or whatever, that these two people were the same people, and we don't. It's almost like the assumption of modern history is that two people are absolutely identical unless you can prove they're the same person, whereas in the past it was kind of they're all the same people even though they got different names, unless we find out something that says they had to be two different people. So somewhere between the two is the natural balance, but there is some logic to Nathanael being the same person as Bartholomew. Bartholomew is more of, it isn't the kind of given name. It means the son of Ptolemy. You see, so people often got known by those things because actually, if you knew several people with the same name, you better to say so and so who's the son of so and so. So Bartholomew is more like a surname. It's not a surname, but it's more of a kind of an extension name. So Bartholomew clearly has a given name, but we don't know what it is from the Synoptic Gospels, because Bartholomew appears in the Synoptic Gospels and Nathanael appears in the Gospel of John, and they both seem to be presented as kind of core disciples at this stage. And what we also find is that through the Synoptic Gospels, whenever we meet Philip, we always find he's right there with Bartholomew. And church traditions and the stories we're going to look at of their martyrdom also see them doing missions work together after the crucifixion and resurrection. So we find that Philip and Bartholomew are kind of joined in church thinking and within the Synoptic Gospels. And here we see Nathanael as a friend of Philip, and we don't have a first name for Bartholomew. If you think of it like that as a first name, we don't have his kind of given name. Nathanael is a good one; it fits. And so I think there's a lot of credibility in the idea. Otherwise, Nathanael not only disappears from the text of the New Testament, he also disappears from church history. Because we remember the apostle by the name Bartholomew. But that shouldn't shock us too much. Remember, Matthew is also really Levi. That's a totally different reason. We'll probably cover that when we come to him, when we get to the text. And that was all of that was, why did I get, all of that I said is because actually Bartholomew, stroke Nathanael, is there when Philip gets martyred, according to the stories and the traditions. And which I did jot down some notes, because I never do these things quite from memory, because I'm not so familiar with the kind of traditions of the church as I am with the Gospels, somewhat obviously. That is the way probably it should be. So yeah, Philip actually gets martyred according to the stories in Hierapolis, and actually what we're told is he's been travelling when he's doing his missionary work and evangelism in that kind of Syria, Turkey area. He travels with his sister, who's called Mariamne, which is actually a variant of the name Mary. It could also be of Miriam. It works for both of them, apparently. So he's got a sister who would probably originally a Mary or a Miriam, but who comes to us known as Mariamne. And who is actually kind of beatified eventually. She becomes a saint because she travels with him according to the stories and the legends. So they've been travelling. He actually gets martyred in Hierapolis. He's there with his sister, as I said. He's also there with Bartholomew, and actually the story there, Yeah, okay, got my notes here. Right. So when they're there in Hierapolis, they there's a man called Stachys who's been blind for 40 years, and Philip heals him. See, and so the story goes out, and then everybody starts coming out. The sick are all there, and they're all getting healed, and the multitude gets saved, and it causes a bit of a ruckus, a bit like we read about with Paul in the Book of Acts. So they get arrested and have to give an account for themselves, and the pagan priests are saying that they're disrupting things, and so they're sentenced to execution, and all three of them are going to be executed. See, so they crucify Philip, and they start to crucify Bartholomew, and then there's an earthquake, and the earth splits as Philip dies, so that kind of disrupts things somewhat. And so Bartholomew is let go with Mariamne, and they actually appoint Stachys as the first bishop of the town, and then they move on from there, and so it's kind of a nice little bit of a mix. As I say, we know that the apostles did something, and if you kind of strip out the fact that unfortunately the stories of Bartholomew and Philip actually come to us from slightly later, but there's often enough kind of coincidence, and we're going to see particularly with Bartholomew a little piece of archaeological coincidence, which mean you've got to say these aren't totally made up stories. They probably rely on some true tradition, and so probably there is this. So this is perhaps not unreasonable that Bartholomew is there. Philip eventually dies. It's probably 65, 66 AD by my guesswork, educated guesswork, if I can put it that way. As I said, because there's no kind of hint that Philip has died in John's Gospel, because I think he's presented as an eyewitness. The point of presenting an eyewitness is you can go and talk to them. So I assume that he's alive at the point that John's Gospel is written, but he's probably died before 68 AD when probably Bartholomew dies. So that's kind of Philip's story, about the best as we can do. So what happens then with Nathanael? We'll get onto the conversation and the text in a minute. Well, we know from two different sources from about the 4th century, two different sources in the 4th century make reference to a missionary trip by a 2nd century missionary, Pantaenus, I think it is, or Pantaenus, I can never remember which way around it is, you should say it, who's gone to India and discovered that they've got the Gospel of Matthew there, and it was brought to them by Bartholomew, who we assume is the same person as Nathanael. And that tradition comes from two places, but obviously comes from a single source, which is the story of Pantaenus. But interesting, we'll come to it in a second. There is a nice little tie-in, because India is a very large area. It kind of covers, in the Roman world, it covered right the way up into Arabia. So it doesn't have to be right down into what we think of as India now, but we'll probably see, because there's a little bit of archaeology that kind of indicates is the case. Some work has been done that it probably is a town on the coast of India, a bit further south. But I'll come back to that in a second. So we know that Bartholomew has gone there, but we also have tradition about him operating in a similar region to Philip. And eventually he is martyred in Armenia, which is kind of slightly north of that kind of Turkey area. And they both seem to have some kind of credibility to the stories, as I said. So it would seem to me, if you're kind of putting the bits together, so as I kind of put in my notes, where are we? Yeah, so that both of them, as the tradition tells us, have this kind of commission to do something in Asia Minor, and also in Syria. And so perhaps in the 40s, and so the late 30s and the 40s, when the apostles start to kind of get out doing their missions work, they're working in those areas, because we have some stories where sometimes Philip's on his own, sometimes they're together, and eventually they're there together. So they're doing those kinds of things, and there's even a story about them meeting up with the apostle John just before the execution of Philip. So all of those kind of things are happening, and then for some reason, which we don't know, Bartholomew heads down to India, and it has to be late enough that Matthew's Gospel has been written. And as you've seen, if you followed this series right the way through, I see the Hebrew version of Matthew coming together in the 40s. By the 40s, I think by the I think by the early 40s, the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew is complete. I think up to that point it was being issued in sections, because the codec hasn't yet been invented. It's just a few years away, only a few, literally kind of about 20 years away before the codec is invented, which allows you to bind a lot of pages together into a single volume. So up until then, you've got a handful of sheets. You don't want a whole long scroll unless you've got a big book like Isaiah. So you put them on sheets that have to be kind of held together manually. And so you can see how Matthew's Gospel, which is made up of its sections, you could see how each one, as the apostles' teaching is going out, is kind of being issued to the church around Jerusalem, in wider Judea and to Samaria, where they speak Hebrew, so that's not a problem, that they can read that. And we're told that everybody translated and copied them down as they could, and so actually, of course, it's the Matthew that gives birth to the Greek Gospels, Mark, and then a Greek version of Matthew as well, and so on. But the Hebrew version must have existed when, by the time Bartholomew goes down to India, otherwise he couldn't have taken it with him. And if it was complete Hebrew version, probably therefore after the 40s, so late 40s into the 50s maybe, that kind of period. So Nathanael, also known as Bartholomew, heads down to India. I think that the town is referred to now as Kalyan. They think Kalyan in India. And the reason I'm saying this is part of the reason that there seems to be some evidence for the location. One of which is interesting because it kind of creates an inadvertent coincidence with the story about the death of Nathanael. But then, of course, he presumably comes back because he's then with Philip when Philip is executed, and that, as I say, I think must be after 64, when I think roughly around then that John's Gospel is being written. Because from there, as I say, they leave there, the sister of Philip and Nathanael, Bartholomew. It says that Miriam goes to, I've jotted down where it is that she goes. Philip dies. Yeah. I did put down. Oh, that's right. Laconia. She goes to a place called Laconia. I'll put these on a map once I'm kind of post editing. And she dies there peacefully in time, but she preaches there and teaches there, and eventually she is of course beatified, so she becomes a saint. We're kind of moving on though. It seems then Bartholomew continues his work, pushes up into Armenia, is up on the Black Sea, and then we read about how while he is there, it's in a town which is called, and I've seen it called a couple of different things, so I jotted down my preferred version of it. Same place, but Albacus. There you go, Albacus. So he eventually is executed there. And the traditional story, which has been preserved through centuries and centuries in Catholicism, is that he's executed by a king by the name of Sanatruces of Arbela, and I think he's the one that we can therefore chronologically lock him in. But apparently it's because he kills him because he has converted his brother, who is a king by the name of Polymeos. And what's kind of interesting is that people have often dismissed it because they said, "Oh, Polymeos. There's no king in that region called Polymeos at the right time." So because we don't know of one historically, doesn't necessarily mean they didn't exist. But because they can't find one, they say, "Oh, it doesn't make sense." But what's interesting is in the town of Kalyan in India on the coast, there is an official referred to with the name Polymeos. And so the word king is the problem here. So actually, if Sanatruces, who's king, has a brother called Polymeos, who within the Roman world has kind of reached some level of officialdom in India, and it was actually in India that he gets saved, then actually you could understand how in the traditions and the storytelling it kind of gets blended into where eventually on the Black Sea, where Bartholomew is actually executed. So the events might have actually happened in India. It's just one of those interesting kind of, oh right, that's interesting how those things tie up. So it's all speculative, but you kind of get this kind of picture emerging. But I don't want to spend too long, because we'll never 100% know till we get to glory exactly how true these stories are or not. But it just kind of give you a bit of a sense of who these characters are, and so on. What I've been wanting to do for a while, actually, as we think about when these are coming, is actually just to unpack the conversation that Jesus has with Nathanael, because it's full of kind of full of biblical allusions and backdrop to it, which I never saw, and I can't remember when I first spotted it. I kept asking the question, what's it going on here, Lord? What's going on? And it was in one of